Today is going to be the only day in our lifetimes where it is perfectly acceptable to laugh about the USSR and the Russian Revolution, so I'm making the most of that fact. I've broken out the Ushanka and the red flag, I'm listening to the Red Army choir extremely loudly, and of course I'm going to be dispelling liberal bourgeois propaganda about Lenin, particularly in the year of 1917. Of course, though, it's worth mentioning that Lenin's actions back then basically hold no bearing over today anymore. So this is very much just a self-masturbatory activity of leftist circle jerking, but I'm going to do it anyway. We're mainly going to be focusing on the year 1917 itself, rather than a whole extent of Lenin's time in power, as well, this is the 100-year anniversary of 1917, and this video will be far too long if we analysed everything Lenin did after the revolution, as well as what he did prior to it. But anyway, let's begin by setting the scene of 1917 Russia. As many know, Russia was extremely backward at this point in time. In a population of around 150 million, only roughly 4 million were actual industrial workers. The Tsar was clinging onto power and had sent Russia into World War I with plunder and profits in mind. This was costing Russia many lives and naturally fueled discontent among the public, which had been rising since the Tsar had ordered the murdering of countless peaceful protesters in 1905. The activity of the Bolshevik Party, and most political parties really, had been outlawed in Russia, and as such, Lenin was at the time exiled in Switzerland, reading Hegel, of course. During the February of 1917, tensions were so high in Russia that a single strike from a textiles factory spontaneously snowballed into a full-blown revolution that overthrew the Tsar and established the Workers' Soviets alongside the Provisional Government. This revolution was so spontaneous that even Lenin himself had only weeks before told a socialist youth meeting that he was too old to see the revolution in his lifetime, and that it had to be down to them to carry it out. Even more amazing was the spontaneous organization of the workers into Soviets, which is just Russian for council. This provisional government, after some time, intended to hold a constituent assembly to eventually properly form a parliamentary system for Russia. After Lenin returned from exile, he wrote his infamous April thesis, outlining what the goals of the Bolsheviks and Russia should be. This called for the dissolving of the provisional government, with all power being taken on by the Workers' Soviets, as Lenin had claimed that they were a bourgeois government tied to capitalist interests, which is why they refused to end Russia's involvement in the war like most people wanted. And as well as that, the establishment of a parliament would, if anything, be a step back for Russia after already having the Workers' Soviets formed. Lenin, however, stood alone on these points, even from within his own party, many of the senior members even ridiculing him. It's worth mentioning here, at the time, the Bolshevik Party were actually quite small in Russia, not holding much influence over the Workers' Soviets at all, which highlights how Lenin was not merely trying to argue for the real communists like himself to take power, but rather simply just for the workers themselves, without any kind of parliament. At the time, this being carried out by the provisional government was a real possibility. However, soon after, it did become apparent that only forceful revolution would suffice here, which is what Lenin was forced to resort to. However, by no means was this his first solution. Over the next couple months, the problems of the provisional government became even greater than continuing the war and taking power away from the workers. In Lenin's essay, The Impending Crisis and How to Combat It, it laid out how both further famines are on the way to Russia, and more so how the provisional government not only intended to do nothing about it, but didn't have the ability to do anything even if they wanted to. See, most of the large property owners in Russia at the time were against even the February Revolution and wanted to see a return to Tsarism for the interests of their profits. And so they began sabotaging critical aspects of the Russian economy, in particular the railways. The delivery of food and raw materials had been decreasing and would eventually stop entirely. Unlike usual though, Lenin was not alone on his predictions of this disaster. It was well known that famine was approaching, but what made him different was the methods with which he intended to prevent it. The point that the provisional government was taking little to no action, mostly because they themselves were in the pockets of the capitalists, was even shared by party members of the provisional government. The newspaper of the Central Executive Committee, Izvestia, recorded as a fact the complete inactivity of central bodies set up under the government the regulation of economic life. It is self-evident then that there were no conspiracies here. Lenin only differed in his calls for the dismantlement of the provisional government and self-admittedly soft reforms, rather than proposing only full communism as the solution. Mainly, this involved the nationalization of banks and large industry, coupled with an end to commercial secrecy. Again, these are quite soft measures, But during times of deep crisis and approaching famine, these steps could hardly even be considered radical. But what did make them radical at the time, though, was that these were steps that the existing provisional government had no ability to carry out, due to the conflicting interests of the capitalists. It was here that, as the year went on, Lenin adopted the slogan for the Bolsheviks, peace, bread, and land. These 3 points highlighted the powerlessness of the provisional government, as they were the main demands of the people, peace being an end to the war, bread being avoiding famine, and land referring to returning of land to the peasants. All of which were things the provisional government could not do. Particularly with the war, Lenin had made claims that the provisional government had been collaborating with the French and British, forming secret treaties that promised to, after defeating Germany, continue the war even further than needed into both Poland and Turkey, for the pure goal of plundering the countries for profits, killing even more lives on both sides than what was necessary. These again seem like very conspiratorial claims, yet after the provisional government was abolished by the October Revolution, these were all found to be true. So the prospects of any kind of peace for the Russian people were impossible without Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And as this became more and more apparent to the population, it's what gave Lenin that base of support from both the workers and the army. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Back to the months leading up to October, we have a provisional government willing to let its people starve or die in war, essentially because they were corrupted by both domestic and international capitalists, as well as the eventual goal of ending the Workers' Soviet organization and establishing a pseudo-democracy in the form of a parliament. These things were, though, as time went on, realized more and more by the population of Russia. While at first Lenin was stood alone in making these points, only in the space of a few months these became extremely popular across the whole of Russia, particularly in the cities. And this eventually even led to the forming of Soviets that actively defied the authority of the provisional government. So as this led to the provisional government losing its grip on Russia over these few months, it led to the leader at the time, a man named Kerensky, to outlaw the Bolshevik activity and crush printing press for its newspaper. Furthermore, Kerensky called upon a general of the Tsar's White Army, Kornilov, to help crush worker organization in the cities of Russia to try and reaffirm the authority of the provisional government. This, however, obviously very quickly backfired, as it became apparent that General Kornilov intended to stage an attempted coup, not only crush a worker or Soviets, but the provisional government as well. It's worth mentioning that Kornilov was supported and worked with a group called the Black Hundreds, which are very much comparable to the brown shirts of the Nazis, and that they were far-right street thugs. Kornilov was only defeated because of the very organization of the Bolshevik Party across Russia, and in particular Petrograd, who ended up being called upon by Kerensky after just recently outlawing them to fight back the attempted coup. Had Lenin not been building worker organization the whole time and instead left it only to the provisional government, any White Army general would have just been able to march into the cities of Russia and establish a dictatorship. Lenin later said that this proved the secure dictatorship of the proletariat had to be established in Russia soon, and they could no longer await, as of course this would not be the only attempted coup in overthrowing the weakening provisional government, if not by Kornilov then by anyone else of the many other reactionaries in Russia at the time. This brings me to the point that people sometimes make, that Lenin should have just simply waited longer in Russia for things to properly develop before trying to establish socialism. Not only would have worldwide war continued, famine spread rampant, but then fascism would have secured itself in Russia rather than Lenin's communism, and without any kind of real opposition for European fascism, well, we can say that the result would have made Stalin look like a goddamn anarchist. Alongside this is of course the slander that Lenin's revolution was simply a coup of its own more than anything else. But this of course completely ignores Lenin's intentional waiting for a Bolshevik majority in the worker Soviets before storming the Winter Palace, and the fact that Lenin was calling for power to be seized by the Soviets long before he had any influence in them. As soon as the October Revolution was carried out, the promises by Lenin of bread, peace and land were fulfilled. The peasants received the land they justly deserved, Russia was pulled out of the war and broke all ties with the French and British on the matter, and banks and large industry were nationalized as to end the intentional disruption by the capitalists. Of course though, Russia was far from without problems from here. Lenin had come to power without any real military force to fight the civil war that followed, attacking Russia from all sides by many different nations intending to break the new communist leadership. Mainly though was the White Army opposition, which again intended to institute what would essentially be fascism in Russia. It's from this dire situation Lenin made actions that many criticize him for today. For instance, the dissolving of worker Soviets and the Red Terror. Without going into too much detail on these things, I will at least say that Russia during this time was in a disastrous state, leaving notions of full worker democracy in the state unrealistic for the time being. This was not just an excuse though, as after the Civil War, Lenin went back to encouraging the formation of worker cooperatives in Russia. As for the Red Terror, again, this was during a civil war. The vast majority of targets from this were not, as some on the right might like to suggest, anyone who disagreed with them, but rather active supporters of the White Army, or the members themselves, who by extension are very much comparable to literal Nazis. This goes beyond crushing fascist organization in today's context too, as of course Lenin was literally fighting a war against these people. So really, what do you expect? This has got a little beyond 1917 though, so I'll conclude by saying that every one of Lenin's accusations of the provisional government were proved true, and every one of Lenin's immediate promises upon coming to power were fulfilled. Of course, at the same time though, we must not idolize Lenin as if this was all the work of one determined revolutionary genius. It was the work of the whole Russian proletariat, and that's what makes it all so momentous and worth learning from. Overall, I think this one quote from Hitchens is a good place to leave things. If the Bolsheviks had not come to power in 1917, we'd have a Russian word for fascism rather than a Latin one.